Okay, so let's jump right into this thing. Sorry for having to cancel class last week. Hopefully this will cover our bases. If you have any questions after watching this, or if you have anything you want to talk about, we can certainly do that. This talk is not the most entertaining or exciting topic in information security. However, compliance actually is a very big job opportunity for a lot of people who are looking to get into the security field or the risk management field. There are tons of jobs out there for people doing compliance because there's so many different compliance verticals we'll talk about in just a little bit. If you're looking to break into the security field or the security arena or risk reduction, risk management practice, compliance might be a really good way to do it. You don't have to be overly technical. You have to be kind of a logical thinker. You have to be a very good communicator, both written and oral. Uh, but you don't have to have a super vast amount of knowledge on the technical side because a lot of, even security controls, a lot of security controls are operational in nature. They're not necessarily very, very specific technical controls. Now, there's lots of technology and software and things like that that can be implemented to help facilitate compliance and to implement security controls. But you don't have to necessarily be there or understand how they all work. You just have to see them work and do their function, perform their function, and in the end, be able to assess risk and how deficiencies might play into that, where security controls are missing, how organizations aren't necessarily doing what they should be doing to protect data commensurate with the value of the data, whether it's health records or payment information or personal information or whatever. So, like I said, this isn't the most exciting talk in the world, but if you're looking to switch gears and change into some other new profession that's IT related or security related, it's a really good place to consider. So, compliance in general, we love Wikipedia, so here's the definition from Wikipedia. But yeah, essentially, it's a set of guidelines or rules, even laws, that are kind of enforced on organizations. Um, they are good in a sense that they provide a framework, especially for organizations that are small or maybe even organizations that are large that don't necessarily know what best practices they should be implementing to make sure that their information is secure and their data is secure. Most of these compliance verticals come together because a consortium of people who know what they're talking about ideally or know a lot about risk management as it pertains to different sectors within business come together and they can sort of come to an agreement on what the best way to protect information would be. What are the best set of security controls that can be implemented to make the data secure? Dilbert likes to poke fun. There's lots of different compliance verticals. You'll see on the next slide. I'll just enumerate a few. But a lot of this talk is going to be pointing out some of the flaws of compliance and compliance verticals and the way that they're generally approached by many organizations. So a lot of this talk will be that way, and then sort of a piece of the talk will be giving you an example of maybe a positive way or a good way to do compliance or to approach compliance as proposed by SANS and another consortium of people in the know, I guess you would say. So compliance, here we go. Familiar compliance verticals, you guys have probably heard a lot of this before, or at least you've heard about a lot of this before. PCI is a big one. Everybody the Target breach last year was in the forefront of everyone's mind. PCI kind of deals with credit card processing organizations, banks, clearinghouses, that sort of thing. Health Information Portability and Accountability Act, so HIPAA, you've probably heard of in high tech. Obviously, those are going to apply to health information, so the hospitals and the insurance companies and that sort of thing. SOX is for public companies, and it's all basically around financial reporting. FISMA applies to the federal government, so it's a Federal Information Security Management Act. Is going to tell the government and the Department of Defense and any federal agencies how to secure their information or what controls they need to implement. And there are tons of others: ISO 9000, GLB, NIST. There's a lot of other compliance verticals or sort of pieces that feed into other compliance verticals. Generally speaking, non-compliance results in fines from government, lost business revenue, loss of connectivity, criminal or civil liability is also possible. If you think about what Target's going through or what they went through, probably still going through after the breach last year, they're feeling the effects. And I'm not saying Target wasn't compliant. But actually, that might be a good topic down the road in this talk as we begin to look at where organizations typically can go wrong when trying to implement compliance. Okay. So the intent of compliance verticals, if you ask, the people that write this stuff, it's to, provide better assurance and to make assessment or benchmarks for internal controls. By internal control, we mean processes, procedures, we mean technology, we mean things in place that are designed to control the flow of information, the access of information, that sort of thing. And at the end of the day, assurance, as in providing, great information assurance that ensures the data is secure. Obviously, you don't want your personal information out there if you go to a hospital. You don't want your payment card information to be compromised. All these things play into risk management processes for business. But at the end of the day, you want your compliance vertical and your assessment of a compliance vertical to be able to accurately depict the state of assurance. So basically it's a benchmark, right? How good are you, your organization, at making sure that your information is secure according to a benchmark of security controls? And some of these security controls are 100 different security controls. Some are 300 different security controls with sub controls built into there or with technical controls built into there. It can be kind of overwhelming, especially for organizations that don't necessarily have to, or that are, I'm sorry, that are brand new to it, or that are just standing up, or that are trying to align with a particular compliance vertical. It can be a very daunting task, and it's very time-consuming, very resource-intensive, and that's why organizations will hire groups, risk management groups, whose job it is to internally assess compliance within the organization. Um, to try and raise their score, to raise their level of assurance to a benchmark status according to the compliance vertical that they're aligning to. And then from the flip side of that is auditing companies make a lot of money coming in and saying this is how compliant you are. This is your score according to this particular compliance vertical or this benchmark. There's a lot of opportunity for employment in this field, and again, you don't have to be super technical to be able to get into it. Compliance verticals, while they provide a level of benchmark, they also generally tell you how or why you would want to implement a control, which is often benefit if you're trying to sell management on why you need this particular process put in place or why you need to buy this particular piece of software. So they're really useful in that regard. And a lot of times, their hands, leadership of companies, their hand is forced because law requires them to be compliant. Think of PCI, think of HIPAA, think of FISMA. All of these different compliance verticals, the law states that organizations that process this kind of information or that, for instance, are a federal organization, they must comply with this set of requirements. Compliance itself is a little bit of a gray area, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Okay. But we have standards and controls. We want to implement those, and the purpose at the end of the day is to minimize the risk that the organization has to accept. So here we go. We'll jump into the flaws of most compliance verticals. Most compliance verticals, and in fact, most auditors or most people that implement the controls, I don't say most, I say a lot. A lot of what I've seen historically in all of my years of auditing is that the focus of compliance verticals is, do you have something in place? The compliance vertical will say, the control will say, you must have this particular process in place, which is all well and good, except for it does not focus on how well does that process work. So if you half-ass a process and you put it in place and you say, all right, check, I did this, I'm going to pass my compliance audit, and you may well pass your compliance audit. Because depending on the quality of the auditors, as they come in, they may say, yeah, you're doing a great job, awesome, you have it, cool, check. But if you're a bad guy trying to get in and they don't care whether or not you have it, they care how well it works. And if you're talking about trying to mitigate risk and minimize risk, the focus of the compliance effort has to be less on whether or not I have something in place and more on how well does what I have in place work. It's a balancing act that many organizations try to do. And again, their goal, I think, at the end of the day, is to get a good score on compliance audits, not necessarily to reduce risk. So it's kind of the paradigm of compliance is kind of led to this approach of, can we just check the box and say we have this, and away from, are we getting our money's worth out of this process or this control or this technology or this software or whatever. So it's kind of a challenge there. Another flaw, right? Most compliance verticals say you got to comply with everything. Here's our list of 300 controls. You have to implement all 300. Let us know when you do. You'll get a good score. Until that point, you're going to fail your audit miserably. So that's depending on the organization and depending on budgets and timelines and all that sort of thing. It can be a little unrealistic. Focusing on compliance instead of performance is kind of the same thing as do you have it versus how well it works. But you need to, if you're responsible for implementing security controls, obviously you care about performance, or you should, because you're not minimizing risk if you just implement something and you're compliant, but it doesn't work. Poor scoring mechanisms can provide false sense of security. So, if you get an audit performed either internally or by an external organization, and they focus on do you have it instead of how well does it work, and they say yep, you're good, check, 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 check. Well, cool. Your scoring report's going to say, hey, I get an A plus on my compliance vertical. I am PCI compliance, yay. I can accept credit cards, process credit cards, cool. Um, that can provide a serious false sense of security, and management will be blindsided when they ever get to the point of, hey, our organization was just compromised. We just had, 1,000 medical records stolen. The leadership is going to say, but we were HIPAA compliant and we did all of this stuff and we made sure we were good and we got an A plus on our audit. So poor scoring mechanisms can easily provide a false sense of security. Um, Focusing, incentivizes being compliant for all the reasons we've kind of already talked about, instead of focusing on minimizing risk. Whether it's checking the box or whether it's getting a good score or whatever, the incentivization there is, or the incentive there, the incentive there is to be compliant. It's not on a minimize risk. There's no, if you can get the checkbox for being compliant, there's no motivation, at least inherently, to minimize the risk at that point, because you feel like, in a false sort of way, you feel like you've done your job, you've done your due diligence, and you've passed your audit and you're compliant, and the banks are letting you process your information, or the government's letting you take patients on. So it can be a kind of a slippery slope right there in terms of what the actual goal of compliance becomes. And if you think you're doing really, really well, then it averts your focus, right, onto issues that affect security posture of the organization. So if you're like, hey, we got an A plus on our audit, we're straight, we don't need to spend any more money on security controls because we're good there now, which is obviously not necessarily the case. So that's also can be a big issue. And then the final one, you know, we go through this every single time we do an audit. The way that the language is for each of the controls, and what you're going to find if you ever get in this field is that the organizations that are being audited, or the leadership in particular, wants to audit you, or I'm sorry, wants to argue with you about the intent of the control. They want to say, you know what, this isn't what this is going for. We do this, check, we're good, we're awesome. But when in fact they're either misinterpreting or misrepresenting the purpose of the control. And oftentimes they're going to make it such that it's denigrates the value there, right? The security offered by the control, or the assurance offered by the control, is less because of the way that they want to interpret it, and because it's cheaper to implement if it's that way, or it's quicker to implement if it's that way, or it doesn't apply to us if we implement it that way, that sort of thing. So the goal of any compliance vertical should not be compliance. That's what I'm trying to say. The goal should be increased control, increased assurance, increased security, and at the end of the day, you should be trying to minimize risk. It doesn't matter two craps if you're compliant, or if someone says you're compliant, if you're not minimizing risk and you're still open to compromise, because on the back end of that, it may help you up front. You may pass your audit, you may be in business, you may be good to go, but at the end of the day, if you're not minimizing risk, you've done all that for nothing, basically. So you hear this a lot, right? Going into audits, we'll ask organizations, "Do you have it?" They'll say, "Yeah." I'll say, "Does it work?" And they'll say, "Sure, maybe." Yeah, yeah, I think it works. It works. It's good. And if you're a bad auditor or a poor auditor, you stop right there. If you say, "Do you have it?" and you stop right there after they say yes, and you see that it's running or that it's implementing, or doing something positive, and you don't sort of push in or check to make sure that it's all working as it should, then you're not doing your job as an auditor. If you press in with that second question and you say, does it work? How does it work? How well do you know that it works? Do you measure the impact that it has? Are you running metrics on it? Can you tell me or show me, demonstrate that it's doing what it's supposed to be doing to minimize risk? You'll make the person that you're talking to, whether it's leadership within an organization or whether it's an IT manager, or whether it's just a flunky that's responsible for running, the intrusion detection system software. When you start asking how well does it work, you'll see a lot of people start squirming in a lot of organizations because it's easier and cheaper to just implement something than it is to make sure that it works. So a couple examples for you. So there's a requirement that says a continuity. This is I think this is verbatim. It's been a while since I made this deck, but I think this is verbatim. A continuity of operations test is to be conducted annually for information systems and enclaves. So back to the point about ambiguity with or subjectivity with the way the controls are written, that can mean a lot of different things, right? A continuity of operations test. Well, what's that? Well, depending on who you ask, you could get several different answers, right? You get 100 different answers. Um, this particular organization, their idea of a continuity of operations test was to do what they called a tabletop, a sit down, a meeting, right? Um, and they conducted the test, and the fact of the matter is, as an auditor, what I was told is continuity of operations test was conducted. The results of the test were used to substantiate this. I saw the results of the test, right? So they knocked some stuff over or turned some stuff down, turned some stuff off, just to see if they could get it back up, right? Or if they could continue functioning or doing their job, or if business could continue during an outage, that sort of thing. And so what was found uh, was that the control was deemed compliant, right? And then if you dig a little bit deeper, right? So do you have it? Check. Yes, we got it. We're awesome. Check the box. And that's what this organization wanted. They wanted me to say, yes, we got this. Or they wanted the auditor to say, I don't know if this was me or not. They wanted the auditor to say, yes, we did this. Um, and then if you dig a little bit further and say, hey, well, how well did it work? Well, if you look at it, if you review the results of their COOP test, it demonstrated the fact that the test had failed miserably, right? Yeah, they performed a continuity of operations test annually for this information system, but it failed miserably. The information system could not run, or business could not go on as usual. They could not handle the application of the system being down. Um, the test demonstrated the fact that their plan that they had implemented and their control that they had implemented failed miserably, and that the system manager was unaware of her lack of failover capabilities. She thought that the system, when they turned one piece off, it would fail over to another piece, and life would go on as normal, but it didn't. Right? It failed, and so they checked the box. Yeah, we do a test of continuity operations, but when you ask how well does that test work or how well does it affect the security posture of the organization, you see real quickly that it failed, and then the last sentence there, nothing was learned and implemented after the test. They didn't do anything with that data. It was completely and utterly pointless. So are they compliant? Depending on who you ask, they'll say yes. If you ask me if they're compliant, I would say absolutely not. It's one thing if a coup fails, right? I mean, hey, technology fails. Some things you implement you think will work, they don't. That happens. That's cool. But to leave it that way, especially for a system that might be deemed critical or very important to the business, that's unacceptable. And so doing a coup test just to do a coup test and not garnering any information from it is completely worthless and pointless, right? One example. Another example, here's another requirement: monthly vulnerability scanning of information systems. So the control says that you should be scanning your information systems monthly. Read between the lines there. That means you should be fixing what the scans find, right? Otherwise, it's awesome to know that you have a scan that runs once a month. Um, but to the meme below, it's pointless to do it if you don't do anything with the data. So this particular organization was scanning monthly. I saw the reports, or the auditor saw the reports. We could see the PDFs. It's miles long, and yeah, it's finding all kinds of good stuff that should be fixed. So do they meet the letter of the law with the respect to the control? Maybe, maybe not. I'm not sure. Well, I'm sure they don't. I mean, yes, they perform monthly scans, but if they're not doing anything with those scans, then they're not doing anything, and they're not reducing risk, and so the scans are pointless. So you have to think about intent of controls. You have to think of, well, okay, yeah, does it minimize risk if I perform monthly scans of information systems? Does that minimize risk? No, that in and of itself does not minimize a single piece of risk for your organization. If you do something with those scans, right? If you remediate whatever the scans find, then you're in business, and then you're actually succeeding in doing what you're supposed to be doing. So again, it's utterly pointless to stop where they stopped, right? They're not accomplishing anything. It's not helping their assurance at all. Completely pointless. To the point of being 100% compliant, this deck's a little bit older. John Gilligan, the former Air Force and Department of Energy CIO, testified in 2010 that FISMA is asinine because it requires organizations to implement the entire catalog over 300 controls published by NIST. And so what this does is this incentivizes people just trying to get something in place, right? I don't want to get a 0 on my test. I want to get at least a 50 on my test. 50 is better than 0, but 50 is still bad, right? We still don't want to get a 50. And so what this you have to go implement 300 different security controls incentivizes is let me just get something in place. It doesn't. Who cares if it works? If it doesn't work, at least it's something. It will boost our score. It'll help our score. Our leadership will accept the risk and we'll move on. And so you end up with something in place to satisfy a control or requirement, even if it's not effective, right? And I love this particular meme here, right? Something is not always better than nothing. Again, this feeds back into we're more secure than we are, or we think we are, and a false sense of security and everything. So it can be a little sketchy too. So kind of what I was just saying, right? False sense of security. The something in compliance approach can ultimately deliver a good compliance grade, but you're really not secure. So you have this false sense of security. Interpreting controls to meet your need is the same thing, right? We were kind of talking about that a second ago. If you interpret a control, whatever subjectivity or wiggle room you have with the language of the control to meet your needs because it's convenient or it's easier, it's cheaper or whatever, you're not necessarily focusing on um, minimizing risk, and so you're sort of feeding that false sense of security. You get a good stamp of approval from a bank or from your auditors on FISMA. It doesn't minimize risk. It doesn't do a damn thing except for allow you to keep operating on a network or accepting payment information, which is obviously critical. It's obviously important, but with respect to minimizing risk or providing greater levels of assurance does nothing for you. That being compliant stamp of approval means nothing. It does nothing for you. Um, yeah. If you focus on how you can get around the compliance vertical rather than complying with it, you're setting yourself up for failure long term. And you may be good short term, right? I mean, how long was Target fine? And maybe they were compliant, or maybe they were obviously they were someone that's along the point said they were compliant because they accept and process credit card data. Um, but something was wrong, right? Something didn't work out there. So let's transition away from beating up on compliance verticals a little bit into how we can use them if we put them to practice, if we manage it the right way. So even though they have flaws and their issues, their own set of issues, they're exceptionally useful in a lot of different ways. You don't have to take compliance verticals and try and skirt around them like a lot of organizations do. And if you want to use them and rely on them and implement them the way that they're intended, they can be very, very useful and they can provide a lot of help, right? So one of the ways, and I say compliance gives you leverage, right? A lot of organizations that don't have to comply to compliance verticals are not necessarily in this boat, but there's a huge section of organizations, depending on industry, that have to apply, or I'm sorry, comply with the laws and the compliance verticals that are out there. If you're a public company, you have to care about SOX. If you're a insurance company, or if you're a medical insurance company or a health organization, you have to worry about HIPAA. You don't have a choice. The law requires you to. If you're a federal organization, FISMA, you can't get around it. It's required. There PCI for payment card information, right? If you process payment card information, you have to be PCI compliant. So if you're a bank or a clearinghouse or a processor, um, so using compliance deficiencies to raise issues to senior management is a really, really effective way to get their attention for the security aspect of the organization. Because for so long, it's ironic to me because we see in the news all the time people's identities being stolen and data breaches and stuff like that. And so our identity and our information, our security is at the forefront of our minds, but security is still treated by so many organizations as if we have money or if we have resources. It's not necessarily given the status and the stature that it should, at least not on the budget line, to make sure that things are the way they should. It's always about how can we do this as cheaply as possible, which isn't a bad way to think about it. But if you start thinking about implementing 300 controls or even 100 different security controls, some of that requires technology, some of that requires new people, some of that requires new resources. It's not necessarily cheap, and you can't always skirt it or get around it, by trying to throw the cheapest amount of money at it or the least amount of money at it. So, from a management perspective or selling management perspective, if we need this latest greatest technology, or if we need this new process implemented, or we need to hire two new bodies to do a particular perform a particular function, if that feeds into compliance, it's actually a selling point, right? For management, you can say, hey, listen, PCI says we must do this. In order to be able to do this and comply with PCI, we need two more people. And oh, by the way, we need this other piece of software that's going to help us do what we need to do. Um, that's a very strong selling point for management, especially when their audit opinion or their compliance opinion is at stake. And so, while management should already care about these issues, they should care. Compliance verticals can help them care if they don't. They can force their care, can make them care. So forget about convincing management that it's the right thing to do. Like, hey, we really should protect this data. It's the right thing to do. Uh, Focus more on the repercussions and the risk associated with not doing that particular thing, if not implementing that particular control. So we're going to use compliance as a tool. Self-audit and evaluation is very, very, very important. Even if you don't want to pay to have another organization, or you don't have to pay to have another organization, a third party come in and audit you, conducting self audits is invaluable, right? Because nobody sees it but you, so you can be brutally honest with yourself, right? And you can stop worrying about minimizing, or maximizing your scores, and you can start worrying about minimizing risk. And what I'll tell you is the first time you do a true, honest self-evaluation audit about your organization against some compliance vertical, you're gonna see where all your holes are really fast. And so what you need to do is you need to worry less about compliance scores and more about minimizing risk. If you minimize your risk, your compliance score will go up. I promise you. They work together like that. And so thinking about how to work compliance in on performance-based metrics is a really strong way, and then continuous monitoring on a regular basis, right? That's all part of self-audit, self-evaluation. Being able to leverage automation whenever you can is clutch as well. A lot of things don't require these days anymore, don't require an extra body or two or three or five or a team. A lot of it can be built around automation. Now, I'll say this with automation: don't ever think that automation is a silver bullet, because it's not. If you implement automation, you still have to put processes and people and policy and all that sort of thing around the automation to make sure that it basically plugs in nicely to your organization and to the way you do business. But it's a really great way to require less human resource in a lot of different ways. And technology and automation obviously has come a long way and continues to grow and accelerates, um, you know, problem resolution in a lot of different areas especially when it comes to compliance on the technology side. Focusing on quick wins and most important are relevance controls. So focusing on easy controls to implement can make compliance work for you a little bit better. It can boost your score, and focusing on things that are most relevant to you. Obviously, every organization doesn't face the same challenges, doesn't face the same risk. So there are certain controls that have particularly less impact on minimizing risk than others do. So focus on the ones that are going to give you the most bang for your buck, basically. And if your organization is not subjected to a particular compliance vertical, pick one, find one, and just do a self-assessment, do an assessment, or it'll at least give you a benchmark of how you might tackle the process and how you might boost your level of assurance, boost your risk management controls, minimize risk, even if you're not necessarily required to comply with a particular vertical. It's a really strong way, and we'll talk about this in a minute. The consensus audit guidelines might be a good way to begin thinking about that. So just to reiterate, self evaluation audit, you're going to have less compliance, but you're going to have more risk minimization. And so your approach here will be the foundation of your audit execution. So if you think about the two examples earlier, if you're focusing on do I have it, you're going to do really well, right? Yeah, we got this in place. It's awesome. It's great. But if you start to think about whether or not it works and how well it works, and if you have metrics focusing on how well it works or how well it does what it's supposed to do, you may see that your scores are going to take a little bit of a turn down. And that's okay. That's good because you're identifying where you're deficient or where you're weak. And that's good. If you're jeopardizing audit opinions, or if your audit opinions are jeopardized because of compliance issues, you will certainly make it onto your leadership's radar, right? Especially, if your compliance vertical is based around law or predicated on law. Um, they don't want to get fined. They don't want to have some legal, whether it's criminal or civil action brought against them. They're going to care. So it's kind of a really good thing, honestly. Um, if you're honest and you're brutally honest, especially your first time through, you will certainly, it's a rude awakening. You'll get a reality check to see where you are. I've heard a couple different security managers, risk managers take over from predecessors or from people that had moved on, who implemented a yes we have it check kind of approach, and then when they come in and they do this self-evaluation or audit, where they're kind of peeling back the first layer and actually trying to get an idea of how well what's been implemented works. It's a rude awakening, and they have their job cut out for them. And it's always interesting to hear stories about how they have to go tell management that they need all these resources because the guy that was there doing it before them wasn't doing their job. And if we're going to be compliant, if we're going to minimize risk, then that's a pretty critical piece. So again, weigh compliance on performance. Shift from focus from do you have it versus to how well does it work. Don't ask if a policy exists or standard operating procedures exist. Ask the people you're auditing to demonstrate that the policy is working or that the procedure is working. Verification is the linchpin. It's a huge role in measuring compliance. So just to say, hey, do you have it, and having some system administrator, some risk manager, or middle manager tell you that they do is insufficient. You need to see it. You need to see documentation. You need to see results of processes. You need to see screenshots, or you need to see it executed in real time to show that it's actually working and doing what it's supposed to be doing. And at the end of the day, if it doesn't mitigate risk or minimize risk, regardless of the compliance vertical, it needs to be documented as insufficient. So there's no compliance control that's just going to have you do something um, in a vacuum that's pointless or doesn't in some way affect the risk associated with the organization or accepted by the organization. So, if you're checking a box or if you're reading a control and you can't see how it provides value, then you're probably not reading it right, or you're probably not implementing it right. Intent is the purpose, right? Think about intent. Read between the lines of the control. The goal is to minimize risk. It's not to make you do a bunch of mundane tasks that are really expensive and have a lot of effort put into them or require a lot of effort to put into them to do the right thing or to make it work, right? They're not just trying to give you busy work. The purpose of the compliance vertical is to make you more secure. Oops. Continuous monitoring is important, right? So an audit is a snapshot in time. If I come in and I do an audit of your organization tomorrow, as of tomorrow, this is what your organization looks like. The day after tomorrow, your organization could look completely different. So the idea of continuous monitoring is important. Um, Audits alone are insufficient. They need to be on a regular basis. They need to be on a regular basis. What FISMA implements is a 3-year comprehensive audit every 3 years, and then annually you're supposed to do an annual review, which is essentially just a checks and balances to make sure that what's been implemented or what was assessed or deemed in the audit opinion that the prior sort of full-scale assessment is still true today. And if it's not, then you need to take corrective action to make sure that it does align appropriately. PCI audits, I think, and HIP audits, I think, are done annually as well. Um, but yeah, so anyways, continuous monitoring. Yeah, if you're not monitoring your controls, you'll never be able to demonstrate the security posture of the organization. Ignorance is not bliss in this case. Spot checking is useful, um, you know, uh, to get a good, if you take a good sample and we'll actually talk about this in a few minutes with the compliance audit guidelines. But taking samples is a good way to do it, especially if the organization is exceptionally large, um, especially when you're auditing things that are manual based. If you have controls that are implemented that are manual processes or manually implemented, it can be very challenging to try and implement them across, to try and assess them across the entire board of the organization. Um, for instance, one of the organizations I contracted for had 300 different locations around the world, and so we tried to take a healthy sample of those different locations, um, either by purpose or function of the organization, of the office location, or geographically or different countries, regionally, whatever. We try to take a healthy sample so that we can sort of get a good picture, a good enough picture of how the organization is doing with respect to implementing certain controls, and that's generally sufficient. In some validation processes, you can use automation, and then your goal should be to hit everything where automation fits in. Think of vulnerability scanning, for instance. If you can scan everything, that's more proficient than scanning small pieces or small chunks or small got it, yeah, or small sections or samples. Okay, so automation, wherever automation can fit in, automation is a tool. It's a strong point. It's a lot easier on the organization trying to implement the control, as well as the auditor trying to actually validate that the control is working. So you'll see a lot of auditors come in on the technology side with different tools, automation to help make this work. But on the implementation side, from the organization that's trying to be compliant, automation can absorb a lot of the headaches that come along with being compliant um, with the technology. Hang on a second. Uh, Sorry. Um, Yeah, so when it comes to automation, I mentioned before it's not necessarily a silver bullet when you're implementing automation to try and align with a particular control or to become compliant. Um, and when you'll see this a lot for a lot of different organizations, it can absorb a lot of headache, but it doesn't necessarily work when the organizations are very stovepipe. And by that I mean you have sort of different areas within your organization that do their own thing. They have their own budgets, they implement their own technology, they do what they want to do when they want to do it. There's no sort of master plan or strategic plan for the organization at the management level. And so you may find that, oh well, this organization over here just implemented this log management tool, so we can basically audit our audit logs and make sure that we have a good idea of what's going on, especially if we ever run into a compromise and we need to go back and see historical data, that sort of thing. And then you have another organization over here who might implement a completely different log management system, and the two can't communicate. And so stovepipes can be very very challenging in organizations that are really large, especially. So standardization across the board, or strong leadership across the board, especially with respect to technology, and very solid change control can be huge and vital when it comes to implementing um, automation that's going to facilitate compliance. Um, Management needs to support the automation. That's also a big one, right? If the lower ranks say, "Hey, we're going to implement this. Everybody needs to start using this," but management doesn't get on board and they don't force people to do it, or to use it, or to leverage it, then you're going to find that unless the software is just absolutely loved um, by by the user base or by the people that are required to use it, it's not going to necessarily work unless management's backing it. And if they're not purchased with the future in mind, then you're shooting yourself in the foot. And you're solving a problem right now, yeah, maybe, but you're going to outgrow that solution very, very quickly. So without these prerequisites being met, software becomes expensive or more expensive, even more expensive. It competes for priority and acceptance, especially in the stovepipe environment. It's not going to perform as well as you hope it does. It'll be, I can't tell you how many times I've seen this. It'll be purchased but never implemented, or at the very least not utilized to its full potential. I can't tell you how many different software packages I've been in organizations, or even hardware too, where they purchase it and they never implement it because everybody's not on the same page. So they just go spend hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe millions of dollars on hardware or $100,000 on software, and then they never implement it. It's a complete waste. And some of that was government. It was great. But without these prerequisites, at the end of the day, the software will fail. It won't do what you want it to do. And when someone comes in to audit your environment, or if you look at your environment and you're trying to assess how well your new automation that you just implemented is actually minimizing risk, you're going to see that you're failing miserably there, and that it's not. So you have to, before you think software is just a silver bullet and boom, you're in place and you got it. Um, think twice. You need to do some sort of assessment to make sure that the software is going to work and that it's going to perform at the level you're expecting it to perform at the end of the day, to minimize risk. So automation is not the end all be all. Good management sort of processes that leverage automation are very important. Looking for quick wins. So this is where I will generally start. If I'm trying to help an organization become compliant, I will isolate those controls that are the simplest to implement or that just need a little tweaking just to make them perform better. So it's easy to sell compliance to management when you say, hey, here's 10 things we can knock off the list right now. It's very, very simple if you just implement this one process. And management loves that sort of stuff. So some risks are easier to mitigate than others. So easier can mean quicker, as in quick win, but it can also mean cheaper, which obviously another selling point to management. Quick wins mitigate and remediate vulnerabilities easily, and they're easy to implement. But that doesn't mean take the something is better than nothing approach. It's not what I'm preaching here. So you want to make sure that even though it's a quick win or a cheap win, that it's actually reducing risk, right? Um, it can mean policies, it can mean procedures, it can mean processes, it can mean edicts from management, it can be software, it can be a lot of different things. It can be a lot of different things. Quick wins are great, and I'll generally start there because you kind of build a head of steam when you start tackling things that are very easy and very simple. You build that head of steam within the organization, and as management sees and tastes a little bit of success, even if they are quick and easy, it helps to motivate them to continue the road, right? So I kind of alluded to this before. Some organizations don't have compliance verticals that they're required by law to comply with. So should people who work for those kinds of organizations or should organizations even care about any of this stuff we've been talking about? And the answer is absolutely yes, right? Again, the goal is to minimize risk. That's the point of all of this. It's not to be compliant. It's not to do anything other than to minimize risk and protect your data. So benchmarking is a good way to do that, right? Whether it's picking, PCI vertical, or compliance vertical, or whether it's going to look at NIST, or whether it's looking at HIPAA, requirements. Um, I advocate to just pick a control set. We audit an organization right now that's not required to comply with any compliance vertical whatsoever. And so what they did is they decided they wanted to go with COBIT. COBIT's another sort of benchmarking um, process for technology, and actually not just technology. It's not just security. It's operational. It's a lot of different things. But they don't have to, but they just choose to. They're kind of relying on the fact that, hey, a bunch of smart people came together and said this is how we should secure our data, and this is how we should be secure and operate. And they're basically putting their trust in that to say, hey, this is a good way for us to benchmark ourselves and to kind of get an idea of how well we do the things we do and how well we protect our data and how well we mitigate and manage risk. So whether it's picking a set of controls from NIST or whether it's looking at ISO or if it's looking at the Department of Defense used to have a document. I don't think it's still being used these days. 8500.2 is a set of controls. Or what we're going to talk about here in a second is the consensus audit guidelines. And this slide's a little bit outdated. I think they're up to 25 now, top 25. Um, but yeah, just pick a compliance vertical and go with it, run with it, and try and benchmark yourself against that. So we'll talk a little bit about this. I'm not selling this, but it's a really good. The compliance audit guidelines are a really good place to start if you just need somewhere to begin. If you're not required by law to adapt some or adopt some compliance vertical, this might be a good place to start. And we're going to walk through a particular control, but what they do with this is they give you everything that you need. They tell you why the control is important. They tell you how to implement it. They tell you how to get metrics on it. They tell you how to test it. So it's really, really strong as an approach to compliance. But back in late 2009, so 6 years ago, I guess, they came out. SANS is a security organization. They came out with a top 20 security controls, and it was basically a consortium of people from the NSA, the U.S. CERT, Department of Defense, Energy, State, a bunch of commercial organizations came together um, to sort of build the top 20 things that every organization should implement to help minimize risk for their organization and to help them be secure. So a lot of these are technical in nature. A lot of them are based on external threats, which might be a downside to this particular list of 20, but they're not all that way. So, but what I want you to focus on here is less about the controls themselves, because we're just going to look at one, kind of step through one, but more about the way that they outline the control is kind of what I want you all to see from this. It's written to address a lot of the flaws we talked about earlier. For instance, it's not 300 controls that they want you to implement; it's 20. And they say if you implement these top 20 controls, then you're covering 70, 80, 90% of your bases, right? And maybe that's true. I don't have an exact percentage. I'm just sort of conjecture there. But what they're saying is you can get the most bang for your buck by implementing these 20 things rather than trying to implement 300. All of the controls are performance based, so they provide metrics on how to measure and test how well that they do what they do. Um, they emphasize the use of automation, and so they actually point not to software solutions, exactly. It's not a selling point, but they point to different pieces of automation that you could use. I think there's 15 controls, and this is probably all changed now if you go look at it now. But at this time there were 15 controls that were predicated on automation that you could implement automation to help you with, and I think there were 5 of the 20 that um, were more manual in nature or procedural operational in nature. And the nice thing too is that these 20 controls can also be mapped or back to other compliance verticals, other controls that are associated with other compliance verticals. Again, you can pause it and kind of look through this, but the controls focus on reducing attack surface area and preventing initial compromise, but they also focus on identifying targets that have already been compromised. So you probably have heard stats out there before that say many organizations don't find out that a particular asset's been compromised until it's way past the opportunity to really do anything about it. And that's kind of a sad state of affairs. In a perfect world, we would know immediately once something's been compromised, not necessarily down the road. If you only perform, um, say a vulnerability scan that focuses on the configuration of a particular web server. If you only perform that scan monthly, well, if I perform it today and I get compromised tomorrow, ostensibly, I'm not going to know that I've been compromised until 30 days later when I do this scan again and see that things have been changed, right? So the idea is being able to identify that a control or an asset has been compromised immediately provides a lot of value. Here's the top 20 controls. Again, this was 2009. This is version 5, but I think I saw recently that they're up to top 25 now. So some of this may have changed, may look a little bit different. I should probably update this deck, but for the purposes of what we're doing here, this is sufficient. But you can see if you want to pause this and kind of read through this. This is the top 20 things that SANS and this consortium of people came together and said we need to be doing this. This is what we need to be doing. If we're gonna tackle security, these are the most important things that we should do. And it's all debatable as well. I mean, some organizations this is more relevant, some organizations maybe less. Some organizations maybe there's some controls that are left off of this list that they would rank higher. It depends on the organization, but again, this is just a good place to start. So for each of the 20 controls, the critical security controls detail the following. They tell you how the attacker can exploit the lack of this control. They tell you how the control can be implemented, automated, and having its effectiveness measured. They give you procedures and tools for implementing the control, and they do vet some products and say this is a really good product for you to put in place here. They give you metrics, so how to measure the success of your implementation of the control, and then they give you test procedures to say, okay, this is how you would go check to see if this control is performing at the level it should be. Um, this is all sort of speaking to the issues that we've kind of outlined before, right? Um, it's all designed to make it really easy, to make it really helpful. So we're just going to take this step through the 5 areas of one particular control. It says inventory of devices, and basically this control says that you should have an inventory of all the devices that are residing on your network. If you don't have an inventory of all your devices residing on your network, a couple things, right? A, you don't know what you don't know. You don't know what's out there or on your network. Um, B, you don't know if something new has been added to your network, right? That's not control. And C, you don't know if something's been taken off of your network. There's a lot of different things that go into this, but it's a really important to be able to measure risk and to talk about where your data resides by understanding what exactly is on your network. And if you don't have a clear picture there, then you have a problem, right? So this is a very logical top 20 security control. It makes sense, right? It's a necessary thing. So if we're thinking about how attackers might actually exploit the lack of this control, many times new systems that are attached to the network aren't hardened, right? So we have a standard image that we use. We don't know what's necessarily going on this particular machine when we clone it, so we're not going to lock down all the services. We're not going to lock down all the accounts. We're going to basically make it easy for the system administrators to, you know, get to work with this new machine once it's been cloned, and they can install their software, stand it up, do what they need to configure it, that sort of thing. And the onus of securing or hardening the server or the device is on the administrator who's actually going to be running it, right? So a lot of devices might be added to a network, or sometimes devices can be added to a network that have not been hardened, and attackers will look for this, right? Mobile devices aren't always able to receive patches and updates, right? So if I'm on a laptop and I've been off the grid for a month, and I plug my laptop back in, um, I probably haven't received the last 200 patches that have been pushed down by Microsoft or whatever, or Adobe, Java, whatever. You can't secure devices you don't know exist on your network, and again, generally speaking, you just have insufficient control. So if you're talking about how to pitch management on, hey, we really need an asset management solution, or we need to have a really good idea of what's on our network, this is a way for you to build a case to sell management on implementing it. So they give you quick wins, right? So deploy an automated asset inventory discovery tool. So there's lots of software out there that does free software out there that does that. Um, Subcontrols will be record specific attributes about each device, right? So let's get the name of the device, the IP address, MAC address, who owns it, who the data custodian is for the data that resides on it. Basically collecting dimensions or attributes about each device that's residing on the network is a subcontrol there. Ensure the inventory monitoring tools are up to date, real time, and alerting when deviations are identified. So, again, an audit's a snapshot. So if you have continuous monitoring capabilities, when someone plugs a new device into your network, depending on your asset discovery tool that you've implemented, it should ideally be able to identify that, hey, something else has been plugged into the network that wasn't here previously. If we're talking about boosting, the assurance of this control, you could consider encrypting the asset database, limit access to it, log access to it, that sort of thing. And then if you want to really drill down, you could start looking at USB tokens, external hard drive, peripheral devices, printers, mouse, keyboard, that sort of thing. But again, the idea here is that here's how you might go about implementing the control and measuring the control. So procedures for implementing automation with respect to this control. So identify documenting organizations and individuals responsible for each component of information and device stored in the data management system. Once the inventory has been assembled, use automation to pull relevant information about each device. So we kind of spoke to that as a procedure, right? Um, on a regular basis, right? Because that kind of stuff can change. Perform network sweeps on a regular basis, leverage fingerprint capabilities. So if we're trying to detect operating system, for instance, there's a lot of software out there that'll do that for you. Use passive techniques to listen to network interfaces and look for devices that announce their presence sending traffic. So this is one way that you might actually identify something else or something new has been plugged into the network. Think about wireless devices, think about devices that come and go, virtual machines that might get turned on and off, remote machines, um, all of that stuff, right? Feeds into, at the end of the day, having a robust inventory of devices on your network. Metric wise, so again, the goal here is to give you something to, we're focusing on performance, right? We're not focusing on do you have, we're focusing on how well does it do what it's supposed to do. So the CAG gives you metrics as well. In this particular case, you should be capable of identifying a new unauthorized device connected to the network within 24 hours, not 30 days, not a week. A good metric, a good goal is within 24 hours. It should also, a good solution would isolate the system, the unauthorized system, within 1 hour of initial alert. So, hey, we realize this machine's just been plugged in the network. Um, a good software solution will isolate that device immediately or within an hour and send an alert that says, hey, this machine just got plugged into our network. We don't know what it is. Somebody needs to go check it out. Um, and continue to alert until the system is removed from the network or until it's added to the whitelist, right? The authorized list of machines, because that happens, right? The goal is obviously the metric above, right? That's one goal. But a better goal would be to say we want a notification within 2 minutes of the device being plugged into the network, and we want isolation within 5 minutes. So you can always improve, right? You don't have to, maybe your initial implementation says, hey, we can do this 24-hour thing and we can do this 1 hour thing. That's cool. But what we want to be striving for is, a 2 minute notification with 5 minutes and isolated within 5 minutes. So it kind of gives you sort of this is where you might start, but this is where you want to end. This is where you want to get to. And then the great thing again, it tells you how to test. So if you're an auditor or if you're somebody that's just looking for ideas on how you might go in and assess or perform an assessment, here's a way to test the value or the functionality, the how well the performance of this control is working. Go take 10 systems, plug them into that are unauthorized, plug them into different subnets within the network, within the infrastructure, and see if the system works, right? See if they get identified, see if alerts get sent that say, hey, these systems have been plugged into our network and they're not authorized. Um, See if they are quarantined or isolated within an hour or within a reasonable amount of time. Verify that the alerts are being sent out on a regular basis until the machine is either added to a whitelist or until the machine, is taken offline or off the network. Um, if you take a machine that is whitelisted, it should be allowed to get on the network. It should be allowed to connect and shouldn't be isolated. Um, and basically, this just gives you a really robust way to test to make sure that the software that you just implemented, the automation that you just implemented, and the processes and procedures that you just implemented actually do what they're supposed to do. It's not like, hey, do you have a asset inventory? Well, yeah, we do. It's right here on the spreadsheet. Cool, check. You're compliant. It's not like that, right? This is a lot more robust, a lot more detailed, a lot more capable of mitigating risk at the end of the day. And that's the goal, right? So it gives you a lot of good information about each of the 20 controls that they provide. You get the quick win options. It gives you a tiered approach to implementing the control. Outlines test plans and performance guidelines in the way of metrics. Um, it'll help you identify areas where your organization's weak. And most, if not all, map to other compliance verticals if you are required to by law to be compliant with some other vertical. But again, this is just something that I wanted to kind of walk through to give you an idea of this is a good way to do the testing. This is a good way to think about how controls are meant to be implemented. This is a good way to focus on performance over compliance. This is not the end-all, be-all list of security controls. It's only 20, but it's a really good 20. We'll say it like that. So if you work for an organization that doesn't have to be compliant, this might be a good way to broach the subject with management. Even if you do a self-assessment, um, you can perform your own audit. You can verify your own results. You can do what you can to basically identify weaknesses in your infrastructure, in your processes, in your procedures, um, and it'll give you really good fodder to go to management and say this is what we see when we take a look. Um, when you create a report like this, if you're doing a self-assessment, especially for the first time, or if you're trying to sell management on a bigger security budget or a bigger technology budget to focus on some of these risks that are prevalent in your organization, it's important that the audit report not be an indictment of any directorate. The goal here is to improve. It's not to throw somebody under the bus. So try to avoid finger pointing. And frankly, the more you work together, the more cooperation you'll get. The more it's let's solve this problem, not hey you're screwing up. The more you'll see that the organization and different units within the organization will come together, sort of on a common thread to try and appropriately affect risk. Focus on identifying areas of weakness. Obviously, that's a given. Identify capabilities within IT that already support the top 20. That's cool, right? Because you don't want to just say, hey, this is where we suck. You want to say, this is where we're really good as well. So identify gaps in processes, procedures, tools, automations, performance of controls that are already implemented. See where they can be improved. If you can come up with rough estimations on cost, that's helpful for management. If you can provide ROI numbers, right, return on investment numbers, that's even better. Um, and then provide several different get well options, right? Here's the easy to implement get well plan. This will be really quick and easy and cheap. This is kind of middle of the road. This is something we can do, and it will have a healthy impact, but it's also going to require a lot of work or resources. And then here's how you hit your home run. If you throw this much money and this many people at it and this much time, we can make sure that we're compliant with this particular compliance vertical. So last slide here, just to recap, right? Intent of compliance vertical is to minimize risk, not to be compliant. Nobody cares about being compliant if it's not minimizing risk, or nobody should care, I should say. The unfortunate truth is that people do focus more on being compliant and less on performance, and that's a sad state to be in. Make it work for you. Make compliance. Use it as a tool. So as much as risk managers hate being audited and hate being held to standards written by somebody else, make it work for you. Use it as a tool. It's leverage to get what you want when you need it. Right. Audit processes, automation, continuous monitoring, all of those things can help you minimize risk within your organization. And if you're not required to align with a compliance vertical, choose one anyways, and get your management to support it. At the end of the day, if you're working in the security field, your goal is to protect the data, to protect the crown jewels, right? So your goal, you should want to should be an aid in you. You should want to minimize risk, and you should be able to get management to support it. And this is a really good way to do that. And if you're, looking for just a way to do a simple audit, it's not simple, but an easier audit um, using a really decent set of benchmarks. The consensus audit guidelines, those critical top 20 critical security controls, is really a great way to or a great place to start. Okay. So again, compliance not the sexiest piece of a security job. It's a grind, honestly, a lot of it. But it also has a really great impact if it's done appropriately. And for anybody that might be looking to get into the security field, if you're looking to change jobs, sort of thing, there's a ton of security compliance jobs out there, auditors, that sort of thing. Um, if you go onto Indeed or some other job board and search for CISA, Computer Information Systems Auditor, um, I know in the Richmond area you'll find 100 jobs right now, 100 postings right now. So something to think about. But hopefully this suffices. If you have any questions um, about this or anything that I kind of hit on in here, feel free to reach out to me and just let me know. Thanks. We'll see you guys next week.